If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. For this episode, I wanted to talk about procrastination. I think we have a fair amount of confusion about procrastination. And one of the clear points that I want to make and demonstrate to you is that procrastination is not some moral failing. It's not some example of, air quotes here, lack of discipline. Procrastination is actually, I believe, a problem with our systems in almost all cases. And I'll talk about what I mean by that as we go through the podcast. And we'll talk directly about when you feel that there are things in your world that are getting procrastinated, there are some potential causes for that and also solutions. So we'll bring all of that procrastination thought in to our conversation today. But I realize that procrastination is just one way that things get hung up in our systems, our lives. Perfectionism is another, for example. And we can even add into that forgetting that we postponed something. So I'll talk about postponing as compared to procrastination. And I'll talk about perfectionism as compared to delivery. But all of these things allow tasks to get piled up in our systems and in our lives, and they don't move through and don't move to complete and then move into history the way they probably should as tasks. So we care about things moving through the system, but how do we move things through our list in the big picture? So in our lives, things should move from we're not aware of a task to becoming aware of a task to planning the task to scheduling the task, maybe to performing the task to completing the task to delivering the result of the task. And then things should just continually move through our lives and through our time in this way. But I think there are several different words for how things get hung up in that cycle. And there are some ways that we have tools to help us work through that cycle. But when things kind of get jammed up in there, I don't know that it causes a big backup in the rest of our system, but things can easily get lost or hide in that system. And we want to make sure that everything's kind of moving through seamlessly and, for lack of a better word, automatically. But I think we all have things that hang around longer than maybe they should. And that's bad for productivity. I think any system wants to be a smoothly flowing system. And if it's not a smoothly flowing system, then we can think in terms of, well, is that a symptom of a problem? And if it winds up being a symptom of a problem, then we can treat the problem and have a system that is more calm, more regulated, more consistent. And then we can feel comfortable about our productivity and confident that things do, in fact, move through our system and that we deal with those effectively. We'll talk about procrastination, of course, and we'll talk about postponement. I don't think that postponement is a well understood topic in the productivity literature, but we'll talk about what postponement is and what it means in our world. And we'll bring up perfectionism because I think these three things have a lot to do about how things move through the system. Now, all that said, it occurred to me that we're typically ignoring the lion's share of what we need to be tracking in our systems. When we talk about productivity and we talk about tasks, I think that we're ignoring a big piece of how systems like this operate. And I hope to be able to dig into that with you today and help you understand that, thus a further understanding of the systems that we use and moving on towards greater productivity. And we face a pretty severe problem as human beings. And I'll lay this problem out pretty carefully and we'll structure it so that we can try our best to understand it and figure out how to deal with it. As human beings, we have a large number of things that we want to do. We're driven in some ways to be doers. We're automatically thinking of things to do and thinking of ways to interact with the world, thinking of ways to keep ourselves busy or entertain ourselves, thinking of experiences that we'd like to have. And all of these things together pile up to give us a big list of to-dos, a big list of ideas of things that we want to engage with, things that we want to spend time and attention on. And I think that's great. I think that's an indication that we're made and that we then have a place here on this planet. And our goal is to turn parts of it into what we think it should be. And I think that's a lot of fun. I think that's an adventure and a creative exercise for all of us. But we have to face the fact that we can only do one thing at a time. Anybody that has listened to this podcast for more than an episode or so understands where I am on multitasking, so I won't beat that horse again. But we really can only do one thing at a time. And in order to avoid the multitasking battle, I'll say one thing or a few things at a time. I clearly believe that we're not multitaskers. I think we can only focus on one thing at a time. But I do get a lot of pushback on this. And so just to sidestep the issue for now, we at most can just do one or just a few things at a time, particularly in few compared to this huge list of things that we want to do, of activities that we want to participate in, of ways that we want to grow. That means that we can't progress through that big, huge list very quickly. And by quickly, what I mean is that each thing that we do takes time. Each batch of things that we do has to move through our process, and that takes time. So it turns into being a while before we can get to the next thing we want to do. A while, of course, is a technical term, meaning more than a second, but less than a year, right? These things just take time as they move through. It takes time for us to apply our attention and produce a result in the world. Well, when you add these facts together, so fact one is there's a large number of things you want to do. There's a large number of things I want to do in the world, a large number of things I want to accomplish. And the best evidence that I have is that this is simply part of the human condition. Add to that the fact that we can only do one or a few things at a time. And we realize that we're operating on a tiny percentage of this big list at any one time. Each thing takes time, so it takes us time to move through. Nothing's instantaneous. And so we can't move through this list terribly quickly. The result and the implication of those three things is that there's always a huge number of things that we want to do that we're not doing now. If we say, for example, that there is an infinite number of things we want to do, or some large number approaching infinity, and there's a finite number of things that we can be doing at any one time, then according to mathematics, infinite minus finite equals infinite. So there's an infinite then number of things that we're not doing, that we want to do, that we're not doing, or that we've considered to do that we're not doing now. In productivity literature, we're often told to focus on the one thing for today, or three things, or X things to determine the priority. And I think this is good advice, to determine the priority of the things that are in our list and to attack them in priority order. Prioritization is an art, a science, a process. There are rules for prioritization in your life, and it's a way to organize the things that we want to do such that we do the better ones, whatever that means, first. And then perhaps we don't manage to get to the not better ones. And that's what prioritization actually means at the end of the day. But a lot of people in the productivity space will tell you, pick your one or pick your three or pick your five things that are the key movers of your ideas today. Pick the five most valuable things to do today and focus on doing them. If you get your big rocks into your schedule, then the little rocks will flow around that and you're able to get more into your schedule. And I agree with all this and believe that it's the best approach. And, this thinking is not unusual or earth shattering, that we want to pick a few things to work on. But it's another indication of a more profound and less often addressed idea that the vast majority of things in our conception, in our minds to do, are currently not being done. They're currently being postponed. They're currently waiting for us to address them. The overwhelming majority of the things that occur to us, almost nothing, for example, as soon as it occurs to us, can be done because things take time and we're probably in the middle of something else. So almost everything we touch gets postponed. And I'll have more to say about that later, but not recognizing the fact that we're dealing with such a large number of things is one of the areas where our systems fail us. And I'll say our systems fail us in very specific ways, and I'll get into what that looks like, and we'll define some of these terms a little bit more closely so we can see this problem, and then we can develop or select or set up systems that help us deal with the challenge that we face of how do we deal with the things that we're not going to do today? How do we deal with the things that we're not doing now? And what does this have to do with procrastination? And what does it have to do with another bugaboo in productivity, which is perfectionism? But just to recognize that the overwhelming majority of things that we mentally deal with, we're not moving through the system right now. And what do we do about that? And not dealing with that well is where our systems fail us, because I firmly believe, and this goes back to David Allen thinking, that things that are on our mind are things that distract us when we can least afford to be distracted, and they waste our attention. And if we're focused on getting something done and something else forces itself into our awareness, then we wind up having to task switch. And that's wasteful. And I think focus puts us in our best position to be productive. And so things that interrupt our focus are, by definition, kind of bad things. And don't read too much into the word bad there. So let's take a minute and let's talk about what procrastination is, and we'll contrast that with this notion of postponing. Procrastination, I'm going to say, is unintentional postponement. And if you haven't figured it out already, postponing is going to be the good guy in this set of three things. Postponing is going to be the good rational action that we need to be taking, while procrastination and perfectionism are not. Those are kind of bad habits that we allow ourselves to fall into. So when we think of procrastination as unintentional postponement, meaning that it's something that we think we should be getting done, but when it comes time to begin it or move it along, we find ourselves avoiding engaging with it. Postponement, on the other hand, in contrast, postponement is a planned delay of the start of a task or the start of part of a task, planning to not do it now. And we have to account for the, again, huge number of things that we're not doing now. And postponement is just a rational approach to a world where we have this large number of things that we want to do, but a fairly small number that we can be engaged with at any one time. A relatively small number that we can have in our planning systems, for example, a relatively small number that can be in our visibility at any one point. So postponement, to use the colloquial, so we got a ton of things we want to do, and we can work on one thing at a time. So a ton of things minus one are going to have to be postponed. And it's absolutely required that we do this. And as I mentioned before, almost everything gets postponed at some point. That's true because very few things, as soon as we become aware of them, we engage. Very few things get that immediate engagement. And most things are at least planned, considered. Oh, they don't need to be done yet. Let me finish what I'm doing first. All these kinds of ideas. So almost anything that flows through our system is going to face some level of postponement. And so that's always a rational action and something that we need to learn how to do well. So when we think about postponement, we're thinking about this rational decision to not engage now. And we want to think about what kinds of things put us in a position where we need to postpone. Certainly, one of the biggest and most rational reasons why we postpone something is this notion of priority and this notion of, well, the best use of my time right now is to engage in task A. And task B just occurred to me, and it seems like something that's good to do at some point, but it simply does not have the priority that task A has. And we can talk about different systems for prioritization. Personally, I favor the urgency and important configuration, the urgent and important idea that we get from Stephen Covey. I think that's a pretty good way to express priority. But the point here is that if we have things in priority order, then we work on them in that order, so that things of lower priority are delayed while we attend to things of higher priority. Ideally, I think our priority system, things should move through. Things should grow in priority until it's clear that this is the thing that we need to be spending our time on right now, that this is a systematic and somewhat procedural way to walk through things in our world. But we all know that priority does not grow all the time in this steady sense. Sometimes when we become aware of something, it's already a high priority. When we first become aware that there's something for us to do or something to be taken care of, it's already a high priority. And quite often, this is because we have other people in our world who can give us high priority things that we never even saw coming. Also, if we mistakenly postpone something, which can happen, then we can see that that thing is not growing steadily in priority. It seems to be making leaps in priority, and thus our system has to accommodate that. But we're talking about ideas around why do we choose to postpone something? And so priority is one of those things. So we work on the highest priority item we can find, and we postpone all the other items. I'll say a second reason to postpone doing something, and again, postponing is this thoughtful, rational decision to delay engaging with an item. Another good reason to do that is context. We're aware of a task, and it needs a certain context in which it best takes place. A good example is you need to make a phone call, so the context that you require is your phone has to be near you. What can happen is you expect that context to occur, and so you plan for that task to be part of what you do in a particular time period. And when you turn to that task, that context turns out to be unavailable. A good example is you plan to call somebody at 3 o'clock, and at 1 minute to 3, you look down at your phone and your phone is dead, and you try to kick it over and plug it in, and it needs a new download of the system, but for whatever reason, your phone is simply unavailable right now. So the context that's required to make a call is simply unavailable. And so in this sense, we need to postpone the task. It might be a painful postponement in the case, and that depends on other factors. But a missing context, or a context that did not occur when we thought it would, is another reason to make a postponement decision. Particularly in the realm of context, if the context doesn't appear, or the context is not available when we expect it, then there's really only two things we can do. One is wait until the context shows up, and two is try to create that context. And I think we typically do this. This is typically our problem solving. Because we look into a situation and we say, hey, I need a certain context, and we problem solve to try and create that context. But if the context can't be made to appear, if we can't bring the context about, then we're just going to have to postpone the item. So those are a couple of reasons why we might postpone things, why postponement is a rational thing as compared perhaps to mere procrastination, which is roughly unintentional. We'll deal with that more in a little bit. I would say that good postponement always includes planning. Good postponement, we recognize that the task is not something we're going to engage with now, so we make provision for the task that we'll see it again later, that we'll think through, well, if we're not going to do it now, when will the context be available for that next? Or what in the future will be a good context to do this? I'll argue that many people don't engage in that level of postponement planning because they don't have the right tool or system in place, or they don't have the intent to track a postponed decision. The tool or system needs to track that we postponed it, because otherwise we'll either forget about it or it will distract us from our other work. So again, we've made this decision to postpone something, so we need to record that decision. And a lot of what I'm trying to do here is to make it clear that that postponement is perfectly rational, perfectly natural, and thus should be built into our tools. Our tools should easily accommodate a postponement decision because almost everything we deal with gets postponed at some point by at least a little bit. And we need to make sure that when we're postponing, that we're tracking that decision primarily so that we don't forget that we postponed it, but also so that we can measure our postponement and do these other things about improving our system. And then, of course, the key point is that postponement is not equal to procrastination. Postponement is a reasonable planning approach to the reality that we perceive and how to address it best. Procrastination maybe is not that to the same degree. I mentioned earlier that procrastination is this unintentional postponement, and I sort of brought up the notion of postponement, then we define that. But procrastination is unintentional postponement. So we come to the opportunity to do a task. We come to a place where we had, I'll say, planned to engage with a task or some piece of work or something. And we look at that and we go, well, as it turns out, I'm not going to do that now. And we turn to something else, usually something not nearly as high a priority, and we distract ourselves by engaging in some other work. Very seldom, if you're listening to this podcast, it's very seldom that you're going to face a task and your procrastination is to sit there and stare at it with your arms crossed going, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. More often, procrastination takes the form of engaging in some other lower priority task. And we, in this way, I'll say we distract ourselves from the fact that we're not engaging in our plan. Now, again, I dealt with postponement first because procrastination is not postponement. Postponement is, I'm not going to do it now because now is not the right time to do it. Procrastination is, I'm not going to do it now for some other reason. Now, we can fool ourselves and we can say, oh, it's not that I don't want to do it, it's that now is not the right time. I don't have the energy to engage with it right now. And so we've got to be introspective about this notion of procrastination. But procrastination is certainly a way that things get hung up in our system and don't move smoothly through. So a few ideas about why we might procrastinate. I think, and in no particular order, I think one is we think about our feelings when we're looking at whether or not we want to engage with a task. I've done an episode about this elsewhere. We engage our feelings about a task and we go, oh, well, for some reason or another, that task is distasteful to me. Kind of casually distasteful, not like dangerous or something. And we go, oh, well, I don't want to face that distaste. I'll just procrastinate on the task or pretend to postpone it. And so knowing that difference is a very introspective thing and something you've got to deal with for yourself. But I believe that we overanalyze our feelings to some degree when we look at tasks that we need to do. I think a lot of times we feel like we dislike something for reasons that are not really very practical. We dislike doing some work sitting in our chair with our hands on the keyboard, and we're okay doing other work sitting in a chair with our hands on the keyboard. And really, what difference does it make? So I think sometimes we get caught up in our feelings about a task, and that causes us to procrastinate when perhaps we should just not worry about checking in on our feelings before we start the task. But that's an example of why we might procrastinate. I'd say another reason why we procrastinate is that we can't, or I'll say don't want to, create the correct context. Now, this is probably a subset of the first thing, but I wanted to address it particularly because this is, in some ways, the excuse-making version of procrastination. It's often on my mind that when I was teaching my kids to cut grass, that was part of their chore list that they did here for us at the house. They took care of the grass. In any time it was time to cut the grass, in any instance of grass cutting time, they would not be anxious, as you can imagine, to go cut the grass. And one of the things that they would do in this kind of formal terminology that we're using now, of course, they would never have said it this way. But one of the things that they would do is they would try to demonstrate that the context for this task was not available. An example, in the task of cutting the grass, part of the context is the mower has to be running. And so the first thing they would do is try to figure out a way to prove that the mower was somehow broken, out of gas, it had undergone a total existence failure, or otherwise that the context that they needed was unavailable. And it's humorous to look back on it now, but as grown-ups, I'm not sure that we don't engage in some similar behavior. And we look at a task and we check our feelings, and our feelings say, well, I don't feel like doing that right now. And so we look at the context and we go, the context is just, I can't do it now because the context is not right. But typically, if we face a task with a context that's not available, we'll usually problem solve against that context and try and create it, at least spend some effort trying to create it before we give up. So those are a couple of reasons, probably interrelated. Another thing that I think causes procrastination, this would be reason 3, in no particular order, why we procrastinate. I think we procrastinate sometimes, and maybe a large percentage of the time. I think we procrastinate because we don't know what it is we need to do. Our brains don't know what it is we're asking of them. My brain looks at a task and goes, I don't know what this means. I don't know what action I'm supposed to take. And I'm too tired, lazy, low on glucose to think about it. And my brain says, I'm not going to think about it. And so procrastination happens. I'd rather go think about this thing that's easy. I think there's a lazy brain thing that happens there. And the reason that I want to emphasize this one is because this one's actually pretty easy to combat. Because if our brain can't conceive of a path to a result that we're asking for it to produce, then what we need to do is to make the task small and to spend some time thinking about breaking the task up into smaller chunks. Present those smaller chunks to our brain as an action to take, and our brains are much more compliant. It's the difference between a task that says, hey, review the marketing report, which is big and mushy and vague, and our brains may struggle to engage with that, versus a task of find the most recent copy of the marketing report. Well, your brain is much more likely to be willing to engage in the second of those tasks than perhaps it is in the first of those tasks. So we want to make sure that we're dealing with procrastination pretty well, but we also want to make sure that we're distinguishing between procrastination and postponement. Postponement being a rational, driven decision to not engage with something now versus postponement being this unintentional, artificial delay. I promised to talk briefly about perfectionism. I think this is another reason why things get hung up in our system, is our tendency to be perfect, to try to deliver perfect results. I think quite often that's fear-based. I think that it winds up delaying things moving through our system. And it looks different because procrastination is typically avoiding starting a task. And if you look at it through this lens, perfectionism is avoiding finishing a task by adding more work to it. And I think things do get hung up in our system this way, sometimes for longer than they should, as we dither around and we switch slide 1 and 2, and then we switch them back in a later revision, and we're hesitant to deliver. So just a nod to trying to deal with perfectionism as a form of procrastination. We need to get comfortable with our own best effort. We need to have some courage about our deliverables and about our own ability to perform. And we need to get things out there in the world, because just like in any factory setting, in knowledge work, work in progress is bad. Work in progress is costly and it can be a waste. And so we want to avoid things falling into that in our system. So just a quick nod to, let's deal with perfectionism as well, and let's deliver things as we start things. And then understanding that perfectionism is this kind of failure to complete a task, where procrastination is in some ways failure to start a task. So we do lots of postponing. I think we have to be careful to do it well. Things that you're not doing have a way of lodging themselves in your brain and popping up at bad times being a distraction when you're trying to focus on something else, or 3 a.m. when you're trying to sleep. These things pop up into our heads. And one of the reasons that that could be happening is that we're postponing, but not postponing well. And your system needs to be able to trust that when we postpone something, it will come back and reoccur to us at a more appropriate time, or just at a later time. So because of the facts that we talked about earlier, because there's an infinite number of things to do, because we can only do one at a time, and because each one of them takes time, we have to be really good at tracking these postponements, and our tool needs to do that. I will say this drives some backlog kind of thinking about our task and attention management tool. A backlog, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is a list of things that we're not doing now. And the difference between a backlog and a pile of things you're ignoring is that a backlog gets appropriate attention in a planned and structured way. And so that's part of the system. Needs to be, there's a place to keep the backlog is organized, and there's workflow to examine the backlog from time to time to keep it from going stale. And this really means that we need a better tool set. I'll say that Attention Compass is designed this specific way in order that we maintain a backlog of things to do. That does a lot of things for us. One is it helps us have a place to go at regularly scheduled times and process and work the backlog, so that we're keeping current on the level of priority of tasks. We're keeping current on how our skill level interacts with those tasks. We're keeping current on how that all flows through our system. And then aspects of the tool that help you postpone well. A big chunk of that is to be able to use reminders well. And I think in many cases we use reminders, but we use them poorly. We use task-based alarm kind of reminders when we should not be doing that. We should be using more passive kinds of reminders that don't jump out at us and startle us. But we'll talk more about that in another episode. So we need to have this backlog thinking built into our tool. I'll say another advantage of the backlog kind of thinking is I think the creation of a to-do list on a daily basis turns out is a really bad way to improve one's productivity. And the more I think about this, the more convinced I am that a daily to-do list is simply bad advice. I think it engages the wrong parts of our brain. I think it engages creativity and urgency when what we need is not creativity and urgency. What we need is steadiness and planning. What we need is prioritization thinking, which is not a natural thing for your brain to do. And so a backlog allows us to avoid creating a daily to-do list. And I think at the end of the day, a daily to-do list is bad for productivity. And I think I'm already on the record for this in another episode. And if not, then look for one coming soon where I talk about the to-do list and why I think it's a problem in these areas. But if we have a backlog and we manage it well, then we can avoid calling on our brains to create a new to-do list every morning for us to work on. So our system has to be better. And as I said, Attention Compass is designed this way with this backlog thinking and with the postponement decision as a first-class citizen in our time management and our task and attention management, as compared to other methods that say, well, identify the three priority things and pretty much ignore everything else. Those systems don't help us manage the backlog. They don't help us deal with those postponement decisions in really, really good ways. Now, when I talk about the tool or the system, I mean a system to store information, and I'm talking about personal information management here. Personal information management is an approach to dealing with all the stuff that we have to deal with in modern life, most of which has informational content. And so we set up systems and tools in our lives to help us deal with this. A subset of the information you need to deal with is information about tasks that you need to do. And so, again, the Attention Compass is built around these ideas: personal information management, kind of a backlog methodology, and postponement as a first-class citizen so that we do it well and we track it well and we don't lose things as we're postponing them. And again, postponement being a natural, in fact, a required approach to the environment that we face. I say all that to encourage you to engage in an Attention Compass implementation, because Attention Compass is the best tool I could devise to help us resolve these issues that I've thought about fairly carefully. If you want to do that, reach out to me, find me on dobusywrite.com. Go out and look for, I'll give you a specific place on dobusywrite.com to go look kind of near the end of this episode. But get in touch with me. Let's talk about what you think you need in terms of a task and attention management system, and we'll walk through getting it done. I can certainly deliver for you an Attention Compass implementation. It takes 6 or 8 weeks of 1 hour per week meetings. It's not challenging. It's not terribly difficult. We set up a tool and we give you some workflows and habits that you can engage with that help you do the kinds of things we're talking about in this postponement realm. However, I recognize that not everybody that hears my voice right now is going to leap to their email to get in touch with me and schedule an Attention Compass implementation. So I'll talk about a tool. This tool is built into Attention Compass, but it can also be implemented separately. And I want you to think about implementing this tool in your own life, because it's a single purpose tool with the goal of tracking postponement decisions. And if we can track these postponement decisions, then we can be more confident postponing. One of the things that I say to people is you should organize your life so that you never say, I'd better do it before I forget about it. Because I don't know what is the right time for you to do whatever it is you just thought of, but before I forget about it is probably not that right time. So the tool that we're talking about now to plan the postponement of tasks is a great way to be able to deal with that aspect of life. You will never have to say, I'd better do it before I forget about it. This tool is called a tickler file. It's 100-odd-year-old piece of technology. It goes back to the time when people first started using filing cabinets and manila folders. And it's a way of creating a set of folders to help you manage information about tasks that you're not doing now. It's tickler file. Sometimes it's been referred to as a suspension file. Suspension in the sense of suspending the task, not suspending the folder, right? It's not a hanging folder. It's a suspension of the task. An implementation of this was made popular by Merlin Mann and his 43 folders site in the late aughts. I'm thinking 2006, 7, maybe 2008. And 43 folders describes it pretty well because it does involve 43 manila folders. And the reason that it's such a precise number is because 12 of the folders have month names and 31 of the folders have day numbers on them, 1 through 31. So 43 folders, 12 are January through December, and 31 are 1 to all the way through to 31. And how this works is it creates a rolling month or 12 months or both set of reminders that you can utilize in order to track these postponement decisions. And so the way it works is in the morning, you get up and you go to your tickler file and you pull out the day numbered today, which should be in the front of your set of folders. And you dump all the stuff in and out on your desk, and then you put the folder back behind. It actually becomes the day number of the next month. So if it's the 15th, you deal with, if it's May the 15th, you deal with the folder in front that is the 15th. It's during May. And then when you've taken everything out of it, you put it back and it becomes June 15th. So you have this rolling 31 days and also 12 months of calendar time to track postponements. So you look at a task and you go, well, today does not have the right context for this task and I can't create it. It's too expensive to create the context today. So I'm going to select today when that context is more likely to be available. And I'm going to put this task in the folder of that date. And then in the morning of that day, it's going to reoccur. It's going to show back up in my awareness, and I'm going to deal with it, find the context, do the task on that day. And this is the correct way to postpone something. The correct way to postpone something is to pick a future date in which you suppose or estimate that the context for that task will be available and it will be a good day to do it, rather than just putting the task back into some pile somewhere where you lose it forever. And that's really the way to create this. I'll put a link to a video on YouTube where I've talked about how to create a tickler file on your computer, a digital tickler file, and you'll see a little bit more about how this thing works. But if you're not going to call me and engage in attention compass today, then I want you to think seriously about watching the video and creating for yourself a tickler file such that you can begin to track this postponement decision and see the power of doing that and see how much it helps keep us from procrastination. We also need to work on perfectionism. So we'll talk about that. But the tickler file is a great planning tool. You'd see that it's built into the larger attention compass platform tool set. I'll say that the tickler file is the best tool for dealing with the postponement decision, for tracking that decision. And as I said, it's built into Attention Compass. But if you can only implement part, then I would suggest possibly starting with your own tickler file and seeing the power of how it gets used. I've recorded instructions for creating a tickler file, and you can find them at dobusywrite.com/tickler-file. And I'll include the link in the show notes. So to recap a little bit, I think what we've covered today is this notion of postponement. Not every delay is procrastination, and we want to get comfortable with this idea. If we think that not doing something right now is procrastination and procrastination is bad, then we're going to force things into the system when they don't need to be there. So developing some discretion, some wisdom about the difference between procrastination and postponement, I think is very important. I also think, and I've dealt with this a good bit, perfectionism is a challenge to things flowing through our system. That gets dealt with in other ways, and I think I've talked about that in other episodes. Certainly something that you can refer back to in the episodes that have been previously produced here. So get comfortable with postponement. Think about postponement and do it well. Procrastination is not only postponement that's unintentional, but it's also postponement that's not done well, because the thing that we're postponing continues to sit there and distract us and bother us. And so we need to be more confident in our postponement decisions and more able to do those postponement decisions well and to track them well. So get comfortable postponing. That'll help you recognize when you're procrastinating. And when you're procrastinating, give yourself a break. The first thing you should try is, oh, my brain doesn't know what I want it to do. Let me break this down into smaller chunks and see if I can get my brain going on it. It's not a moral failing, usually. It's not a failure of discipline. It's a failure of your planning to break things down into appropriate sized chunks. So learning to do that and trying to do that when you face a task and your brain runs and hides, develop a process for breaking it down and taking a chunk and at least making some progress against the deliverable that you need to produce. Another piece, and I mentioned this briefly, and I can't overstate its importance, challenge your perfectionism. Challenge the fear that pushes you towards overwork, that pushes you towards the overproduction of quality that you're not getting paid for and that your customers don't want. Continue to think, build your confidence around how good your best effort actually is and produce at that level. Produce early enough so that you can get feedback and see what your customer thinks needs changing about the work that you did. And then you can change that and actually build quality that your customer expects and or is paying for. And then finally, the takeaway is to implement a tool here. If you don't want to do the full-on Attention Compass, which I highly recommend, then think very carefully about going out to the tickler file. There's lots of videos on YouTube about it, and I'll give you a link to the one that I did because mine is a digital tickler file, which may be best in some instances. You can find instructions for creating a tickler file of your own at dobusywrite.com/tickler-file, and I'll include that link in the show notes. But don't hesitate to do something. This will help you deal with about 20% of the things that you need to deal with. Attention Compass, of course, in my view, approaches 100% of the things that you need to deal with, but a little bit is a lot better than none in this case. So I hope this has helped you get more comfortable with the idea of postponing work in your life and that it's absolutely required, and will help you distinguish between postponement and procrastination, which is the delay of starting a task, and the difference between postponement and perfectionism, which is a delay in finishing the task. And I hope that I've also motivated you to engage in making your own process better, because that's how, at the end of the day, that's how we do busy right. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.